Hello and welcome to We Are Not A Stereotype, breaking down Asian Pacific American bias. Thank you for being here with us for this series of talks created for educators by educators. My name is Andrea Kim Neighbors, and I'm the Manager of Education Initiatives at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center in Washington, D.C. We could not have made this talk and series possible without our brilliant speaker and educator, Vishavjit Singh, who you'll be hearing from shortly for their talk, The Turbaned Seekers of Truth, Story of Sikhs in America. As Vishwajit and I are in different parts of the United States, we want to begin this talk acknowledging the people of the land, past, present, and future. The Piscataway, the original stewards of the area commonly known as Washington, D.C., where the Smithsonian Institution is located, and the Lenape, the original stewards of the area commonly known as New York City, where Vishwajit is located. We also want to take a moment to recognize those nations who are not acknowledged, yet occupy or have occupied the lands we live and teach on. I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, since the series would not be possible without their support. This project received federal support from the Asian Pacific American Initiatives Pool, as well as support from Expedia. We would like to thank them for sponsoring this series and for making this learning opportunity available online for educators across the country. I'm now pleased to introduce you to our fabulous speaker, Vishwajit Singh, a New York City-based illustrator, writer, performance artist, diversity speaker, and creator of SikhTunes.com. With professional background in public health and technology, he got his spark for cartooning in the post 9/11 tragedy when Americans with turbaned and bearded countenance became targets of hate and bias crimes. He uses storytelling as a tool to create a space for challenging conversations around identity, race, bias, and being agents for change. He hosts talks and keynotes in schools, universities, government agencies, and companies including Google, Apple, NASA, the NYC Department of Health, and Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. He is the subject of a widely acclaimed documentary films, Red, White, and Beard, and Drawn Together, Comics, Diversity, and Stereotypes. His message and work has been covered by a number of news outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, BBC, The Atlantic, Huffington Post, The Guardian, and Time Magazine. Vishwajit, thank you so much. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. It is my honor and pleasure. Thanks to you, Andrea, for being the force behind this series. Thanks to Smithsonian for putting this very thoughtful and much needed series at this point in our nation's history. More so than ever, we need to tell our stories and we need to create a space for learning about each other. Learning can never end. We just have so much to learn and unlearn as well. So my pleasure and honor to be here. The title for my talk, as I was thinking about the story of Sikhs in America, a couple of things that really stand out. The turban that I'm wearing, it's something that as Sikhs have come into the US over the years, 125 years now, the turban really has confused Americans and others at large as well, and kind of been a sort of that symbol of how people misperceive, misrepresent, stereotype Sikhs. Keeping that in mind, the turban seekers of truth and white truth and seekers, that'll become clear as well. I just want to quickly mention a couple of things here. There is no way you can tell a story of a community of a few million people or a few thousand people in a single session. There are approximately 500,000 to 1 million Sikhs. In America, we've never really had an actual count because on the census, we don't really get to count our Sikhs until last year. Did not have the option of putting in or checking a box that says Sikh. Last year that changed, and so you could check the other box and write Sikh at the bottom. So maybe the next census will have a better sense of how many Sikhs there are, but everybody pretty much quotes somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million Sikhs. That's a big community, relatively big community or relatively small community, depending on how you look at it. But I certainly in no way I'm sitting here and telling the story of that many people, but what I hope to do is tell you some arcs, some themes that Sikhs share in different ways. And we all wear many different identities. I am a New Yorker, I'm an American, I'm a Sikh, I'm a man, and many other things. And my story changes over time. It has changed over time. It will change over time. And it's true for all of us. So keeping that in mind, know that what I'm about to share with you will give you a little sense of where Sikhs have come from, where they're headed, but know this, that they represent an incredible diversity of what America is, and that diversity is always in flux. On that note, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of interweave my story as a Sikh American with the story of Sikhs at large. And I want to start with my beginnings on this planet Earth. I was born in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital, at a women's hospital that is not a hospital anymore. It got converted into condominiums at the beginning of this century, but it was a hospital built in the Civil War era. And the reason I share this image of my birth certificate is there's a few things you'll notice. Well, one thing that certainly stands out of the most that I've circled and read is my race. Why is my race white? You're thinking he doesn't look white. I would like to just preface at this point by saying there's a story of race in America. There are no white people or black people. We know what the color white and black looks like. And we know nobody has that skin color unless, you have maybe a certain condition. But we know for all practical purposes, everybody can agree on the fact that technically there's no white or black people, but there's a story of black and white people, a man-made story, a fictional story that has become a non-fictional story. We live it. We have been living it for hundreds of years with devastating consequences. So I am technically in that story, in that weird, strange, awful story. I happen to be white. The other thing I want you to keep an eye on is my last name happens to be Singh, and that has a long story to it, which I will get into. My mother's last name is Kaur, which again is tied to the story of Sikhs. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back a little bit into history, because if you want to understand who Sikhs are, you need to kind of understand where they're coming from. It's a very young community. It's a faith, a path, as I like to call it, a way of life that started in the 15th century, late 1400s. And I'll briefly sort of walk you through that history, because it's critical to there's certain values and certain ways we try to live our lives that really comes from that time. So the story of Sikhs in America starts in the late 19th century, and starts mostly in the Northwest, Canada, British Columbia, but really very quickly into Washington State and Portland, Oregon, or actually Oregon at large, and then California. And early arrivals focused on construction, lumber work, railroad construction, farming. So in many ways, sort of seminal moments, right? We know Asian Americans, different Asian American communities were a part of early immigrants who built our nation's infrastructure. And a lot of times we forget that, or don't even realize it. So Sikhs were part of that sort of effort, building the infrastructure in the Northwest. Having said that, having sort of set this stage in the United States, I'm going to go back a little bit in history and talk about Guru Nanak Dev Ji, a man who is seen as the founder of this way of life, this philosophy, and he lived in what is modern day the Indian subcontinent. And he just was this amazing character, a revolutionary. We call him a guru. It's a respectful word for a teacher, somebody who brought forth these new ideas and philosophies that millions of Sikhs have been trying to follow since. So this is a map of Indian subcontinent, a little bit of Asia, and these lines you're seeing are basically Guru Nanak being born in Kartarpur in this map, and it's actually a little misspelled, I can tell right now, but he traveled mostly by foot, and the transportation means available in 15th century, and he went all over the subcontinent. I mean, he goes to Saudi Arabia and Iraq and all the way down, and we're talking here thousands of miles here. And he engaged people. He talked about their way of life, and he pointed out contradictions. He was well loved and also not well loved by people who didn't like somebody questioning their way of life and pointing out their contradictions. But that is what Guru Nanak Dev Ji did. And he pointed holes and poked at discriminatory, inequitable policies and values and lifestyles that people had. And he sort of started this way of life, Sikh path, that there will be 9 other men who will follow him. And I want to very quickly sort of talk about a few sort of values and sort of that he put in place that guide a lot of things that Sikhs around the globe, including in America, strive towards. So the word Sikh means disciple or learner. So it's kind of like, we're always learning. And so, and this is true for all of us. We're always learning, whether we're aware of it or not. But the word Sikh literally means disciple learner. There's three pillars of the Sikh path that Guru Nanak Dev Ji kind of focused on. Nam Japa is meditating on the name of the creator energy. That Guru Nanak defines in the following words, and these are words that appear in the Sikh holy scriptures, which we sort of consider as our spiritual guide. These are words, but he used these words to describe this. This is a description to me, I see that of a physical energy that permeates the entire universe. It's almost like physics here. He talks about Ik Onkar, one creator force, energy. Some people call it God, but it's really the way it's described to me. It's like a physical sort of energy that permeates the universe. Satnam, its name is truth. And there are names within the Sikh faith. We call it Vaheguru, but it has different names in different traditions. Kartapur, a creative being personified. It's kind of self-creating, and every speck of creation is kind of comes out of this energy because it permeates the entire universe. It's without fear, without enmity. It's timeless. It's beyond birth and death. But it's kind of, I always sort of compare it to physics because, you talk about how can you be beyond birth and death if you are present in, throughout the universe, and there's always changes happening. Stars are being formed, stars going out of existence. But that's kind of how, Guru Nanak is describing it's beyond birth and death. And perhaps if you look at a bigger scheme of things, well, there's always something being born and dying. Sabhang, self-realizing, and Guru Prasad, meaning you realize some of this knowledge and you can live it with the gurus, with the teacher's grace. And a couple of other things that Guru Nanak really, so we talked about Nam Japo, and then Kirat Karo is something just so fundamental to a Sikh way of life, which is living as householders with an honest living and working hard. It sounds very basic, right? But it's really a hardcore value in the Sikh way of life is to work hard, make an honest living. And Guru Nanak himself did it. He was a farmer. Beyond his travels, when he came back home, he farmed the land. And Vanchako, so this is, I would say, probably in terms of manifestation that others can see is probably a huge pillar in the Sikh path. Vanchaka meaning share the wealth and resources you have, regardless of somebody's race, background, gender, ethnicity. You share that. So there is no sense of ours and others. You share it with wherever you're living, whoever that community is. Somebody needs something more than you share. So very sort of critical concept that it's not always easy to follow, but we know these are the foundation and values we strive towards. So Langar is something that Guru Nanak put into action, and Sikhs to this day follow it. So it's a communal meal that is served to anyone who visits a Gurdwara, a Sikh place of worship, and they exist all over the globe, including the United States. There's many here. But it sounds, again, very simple. Yeah, it's a community kitchen in a place of worship. But you have to think about this. This was created in 15th century Indian subcontinent in Asia, where there's a lot of divisions across caste lines. So just like we have divisions across the race lines, there are divisions across caste lines, and people are put into, here's a higher caste, here's another caste, another group, and they don't intermingle as much, or they will do trade, but there are very defined sort of lines of who gets to do what. Who gets to marry who gets to sit with each other. Guru Nanak, with this Langar concept, which was put into action, basically said, anybody who's coming into this place of worship, and it could be anyone, high and low, it doesn't matter, different faiths, will be served. You'll sit on the ground together, and you'll get to partake a meal together. Let me frame this in 20th and 21st century. I grew up in a middle-class household in the US and in India. My paths have not crossed that much with homeless people or really poor people. Sure, I might walk past them in a street or in a store, but do I sit down with them? Do I say I'm going to share a meal with them? No, I mean, it usually doesn't happen. But the only places in my life where I have sat down, level field on the ground with somebody who is the poorest of the poor, that has been in a gurdwara, in a Sikh place of worship, where I went to the gurdwara, paid my respects, and then when I go to the Langar hall, I'm sitting right next to people who don't have a home. They don't know when their next meal is. They're there to have a meal, and a Langar hall is always open to anyone. Nobody's ever told, no, you cannot do this. Oh, no, first you go do this. No, you come in and you're served that meal. So it's a very profound concept where that inequitable space that many societies, if not all societies, have created of sort of delineating or creating access issues where, well, you have to afford this or you cannot afford this. Gurdwaras and especially Langar halls are spaces where any and everyone can sit together. So you can have the richest person in the world, a king, sitting with the poorest of the poor. And I got to sit right next to people who I know usually in life I would not, sit with them. Not because I don't want to, but because society is structured in ways. So Langar is a really profound concept that kind of tries to break through the architecture of discrimination. And it has done so in many ways. So Sikhs living anywhere around the globe today, you can walk into a gurdwara and you will be served a meal. They'll obviously welcome you a lot and they'll encourage you, yes, you sit down and have langar, and you'll have to sit on the floor. And this is, a couple of images, historical and modern day, where to me, langar is a concept that I see today. We live in COVID times and Sikhs around the globe are serving food, oxygen, PPE supplies, anything that's needed by respective communities, be it in Canada, US, Asia, Africa. They are serving these things. So langar really extends even beyond meals. It's what is needed in the hour. It could be natural disasters and clothing and water, homes. Sikhs serve langar of those things. So a very sort of core concept that has impacted Sikhs through the ages, all the way down to today in North America and the United States. One other place that I want to share with you is sort of this sacred space. Every sort of faith and has like a place that they consider sacred. So this is a gurdwara. This is a gurdwara like many others, Sikh places of worship around the globe. But this is in the city of Amritsar, Punjab, northwestern India, and really sort of considered a very sacred space. It's a beautiful architecture built by the fifth guru of Sikhs, Guru Arjan Dev Ji, in 1604. And just really sophisticated architecture. But a couple of things I want you to focus on. There's 4 doors to this gurdwara. And these doors signify everybody. At that time, there were 4 major faiths in India, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Christianity, and they're all welcome. And that's a profound concept at the time, and even today, that, hey, all are welcome, even though we have different paths, but we're all leading to that creator energy. And with that in mind, you're all welcome. And what is interesting about this space is, and I've been there a few times, when you go in, when you walk through this sort of sarovar, this pool, and you go to the gurdwara in the middle, through the bridge, you have to step down to enter the premises. We call it the Divan Hall. And that is intentional. It's an act of humility, you stepping down to enter the sacred space. So architectural decision made with an intent of reminding us we're all equal, everybody has access, and we step down. Humility is a very core principle, and for lack of a better word, a superpower that we Sikhs aspire towards. One other thing that I want to mention from history before I move into relatively modern history is something that's known as Vaisakhi in the Sikh calendar. It's a month of Vaisakh. It's a spring season of harvest, and many communities have harvest festivals, and Sikhs as well. In 1699, in the month of Vaisakh, the harvest season, Guru Gobind Singh, the 10th physical master of the Sikhs, made out a call to Sikhs, and he did this over the course of days and weeks, to Sikhs around the subcontinent, hundreds and thousands of miles away, to come and gather in the city of Anandpur in the northwest state of Punjab, and many responded. And then he called out for 5 men, just completely sort of giving them to this path of life. And 5 men responded. And it was amazing. These men came from radically different backgrounds, different geographies, speaking different languages, eating different foods. And somehow they responded to this call and said, I'm totally dedicating myself to this path. And Guru Gobind Singh called that path the Khalsa, the pure ones, the community of pure ones. And he gave them he baptized them, gave them leadership rules, and then he bowed down. And the image, the illustration that you see, it's of course an imaginary image, but it's an illustration you're seeing. He himself, the master, became the student. He got on his knee and he got baptized from the 5 Khalsa, the Panch Pyaras as we call it, the 5 beloved ones. And he then sort of gave the leadership of this community, this path, this faith to the Panch Pyaras. And he really, at that point, he said the guruship, the mastership, your spiritual guide now is Guru Granth Sahib, which is our holy book. And we don't really see it as a book. It's a book full of poetry that talks about the values and this energy that we need to connect with, the ikonkar, this force. That would become your spiritual guide. Those words and poetry is your physical. And those words are spoken by Sikh gurus at the time. And amazingly, philosophers and saints from other traditions, from other philosophies. And this is kind of very unique to spiritual tradition and faith traditions, where the holy book of that tradition actually has words and poems from other faiths as well. And again, it goes back to that principle. We're all created equal. We're all on this sort of journey, whether we realize it or not, but it's a common journey to merge with that creator energy. And as part of this Vaisakhi tradition, on this day, the creation of the Khalsa, Guru Gobind Singh sort of gave these 5 men last name Singh. All the women would have the last name Kaur, lions and princesses. My last name is Singh, and it comes from that tradition, that call in 1699, and what sort of then became part of the Sikh tradition. And then we also have these 5Ks as part of the sort of the baptized tradition, where long hair, I have a comb, I have 2 bracelets, usually people wear 1. Undergarment, I am baptized. You get to choose this baptism. There's no age. You are ready. You do it at any point in your life, and anybody can do this, once to sort of commit to this path. And this was, again, also a very profound concept, because one might think like, well, what's the big deal about giving a common name? Going back to the caste system that was present in India at the time and divided people along what they could and could not do, and where they could go and what they could partake in. And these are really rigid lines for hundreds of years and centuries, and they still exist. And it's been a challenge extricating ourselves out of it. But this was a profound concept where Guru Gobind Singh said, all of you as part of this community are created equal, and your last names will never signify now, oh, you're low, you're high, you're all Singhs, you're all Kaurs. And women, it's usually take men's last name. It is true in many traditions, and it was true at the time in the traditions that Sikhs were coming out as well. But with this sort of creation of Khalsa, Guru Gobind Singh said, women are Kaur, they're born a Kaur, and they will die a Kaur. Again, sort of taking with these decisions that might not seem huge as I'm speaking them, they really take a poke at the architecture of discrimination in those regions, but of course, permeating through, across space and time. Now, I do want to say one thing here. These are amazing, lofty principles that people lived at that time and since have lived, but sometimes we falter, right? These are ghost and golden rules to live by, but Sikhs falter at all times. So there are Sikhs today who will have Singh or Kaur as their middle or last name, and some of them don't have it. Does not make them a bad human being, but the point is, it's a struggle to sometimes live by those lofty, amazing values, and it's a daily struggle to be a better version of yourself. And the Sikh path and values are sort of like that guide for you to remind yourself every day, hey, I want to be a better version of myself. And the turban that I wear on my head in some ways is sort of a reminder every day, hey, as you walk out, you stand out. But it's also a reminder to you as you look at yourself, I need to become a better version of myself. And here are some principles I can live by. Having given you sort of that background, I want to situate this now in American history. The year 1776, July 4th, we have the Declaration of Independence, this really lofty document that talks about the values that this nation is going to be built upon, equality of men, having access to inalienable rights. Lofty principles, but it was not a smooth sailing. It took a while for us to sort of put those values into action. And even today, it's a struggle. We've made a lot of progress, but we have ways to go to treat each other, to put into practice the fact that we're all created equal. We know we live in a society that has a lot of inequities. So we're a work in progress. But I want to situate one of the things that I've mentioned, a few things that I've mentioned here is the notion of people being created equal existed before the Declaration of Independence, before some of the breakthroughs in philosophies and ways of life and governance happening in Europe. And the Sikh community is one example of that, and probably not the only one. But we need to keep in mind as we talk about human progress that other communities outside of the West have realized equality. They might struggle subsequently, but realizing and living through some of these values that I've listed here: truthful living, equality of humankind, partaking of resources, realizing divinity of all life, freedom of expression. Sikhs have paid a heavy price for these values and living them and giving their lives. And I cannot get into a lot of those details, but we've had 2 Holocausts that through our young 500-year history that have befallen upon us, millions killed, because Sikhs would refuse to give up their values. They'd rather give up their life than say, okay, I'll just partake with my values and I'll just live by your values. So rulers of the time gave Sikhs at times option: look, you don't have to live by these values, you live by my values. It's like, no, we want to live by freedom of expression, not only for us, for others. So it's a tradition that sort of opened up these doors for, look, these are values we live by. And if somebody forces you to live by other values, you respectfully tell them and you do your level best to tell them, look, no, this is, I live by equality. And if it comes down to you go into the battlefield, and Sikhs have gone into the battlefield, have been tortured and killed, but I want to make sure that there is sort of this understanding that there are communities beyond the West and Americas where people have, they figured out ways of articulating and living by principles of equality and freedom of all humankind. All right, I'm going to now talk about how did Sikhs come to America? And a lot of this has to do with colonial British Empire. The United Kingdom was formed with British settlers and colonizers going all over the globe: Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Americas. The English went all over. And so they spent almost 100 years colonizing what we know today as the Indian subcontinent and all the countries that sort of are part of that subcontinent. And as into the late 19th century and early 20th century, as British Empire sort of dwindled and sort of gave way to the modern world that we know post-World War II, Sikhs started moving out into parts of the globe where the British Empire sort of left its footprints. From Europe to Africa, especially Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, to Australia, to Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. Shanghai actually had one of the largest Sikh populations from 1937 to 1947. But again, it's all dictated by the British Empire and where the British were, their forces were. So Sikhs served in large numbers in British armed forces as well. And that partly also dictates where they move across the globe. And so keeping that in mind, I wanna now talk about coming to Sikhs in America. So Sikhs, we, more than any other group, we stand out a lot, especially men with a turban and beards, always have stood out from the early days. And also, ironically, although we stand out, Sikhs are very, their story is not known to Americans. And so we get stereotyped from the early days to this day. It's been 125 years plus that Sikhs have been in the United States, where we just keep getting stereotyped, and sometimes in similar ways, uncannily similar ways. And sometimes, it changes over time. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the early years first, the late 1800s to the early 1920s. The first Sikh arrived in the Northwest from British Columbia, Canada, into Washington State. And right away, this is a newsprint from Bellingham, Washington State. Sikhs were perceived as Hindus. Hindus is this large sort of group of sort of a religious community, but of largest numbers in India at the time, and even today, it's one of the largest religious community, ethnic community in India. So journalists and Americans at the time just saw these Sikhs arriving in as just Hindus from India. And a lot of these early Sikh immigrants worked as railroad workers. They worked as laborers. They worked in the lumber mills. And we know from story of other Asian Americans in the United States, there were a lot of anti-Asian groups at the time in the United States and Canada who responded as well to influx of Sikh immigrants. There was a Japanese and Korean Exclusion League formed in 1905, both in San Francisco and Vancouver, by white labor union leaders. And they sort of morphed that into Asiatic Exclusion League into 1907. So they could include Sikhs and other immigrants coming from South Asia as well. There were riots. One of the most famous sort of riots are in Bellingham, Washington State, that were targeting Sikh workers who basically were working hard and doing jobs that seemed like some of the residents of Washington State didn't want to do. So unfortunately, Sikhs were targeted by rioters. Some of them were pushed out of some of their jobs and areas they were living in. And for those sort of 20 years in late 20th century, 19th century and early 20th century, there were race riots that targeted Sikhs from Washington to California to British Columbia. So these were the early sort of years that were difficult as well. And they kind of lead into what another sort of interesting story that I want to tie to my birth certificate that you saw that says race white. The first Sikh to serve in the American Army is this gentleman, Bhagat Singh Thind. And he went to the Supreme Court to get citizenship. And the way he articulated, his argument was articulated by his lawyer was that he's Aryan, he's of the Aryan race. So in this story of race that I mentioned to you, the Aryan race kind of splits from Europe, goes into North America, and the other sort of split goes into South Asia, and Aryans are white. And that was kind of the logic he used. But the Supreme Court actually rejected his logic. And it's kind of interesting how they worded it, saying that Aryan has, the term Aryan is just a linguistic term. It's not at all connected to physical attributes. And it's reasonably clear that mere resemblance in language indicating a common linguistic root buried in remotely ancient soil is inadequate to prove common racial origins. Now, keep in mind, again, it's a story, but in that story, in the earlier 20th century, Bhagat Singh Thind was not an Aryan man. But as we know, as I've showed you in my birth certificate, a few decades down the line, South Asians are seen as whites, and the birth certificates are proof that we're seen as whites. And of course, again, it's this convoluted, strange story that was used to divide people, subjugate people, kill people, enslave people. But I wanted to sort of situate that that story kind of interweaves with the story of Sikhs as well. And it's this strange story of race that sort of comes into the story of Sikhs. Hard years. So 1920s to 1940s, we see a lot of sort of anti-Asian activity on the legal and political front. US citizenship is beyond the reach of Asians and South Asians at large with the Immigration Act of 1924, which impacts just about every Asian American community, including Sikhs as well. And we go to World War II, and World War I and II are sort of very much tied to Sikh history and Sikh story, because Sikhs have sort of this interesting place in British Empire. They initially fought the British Empire. The British defeated the Sikh Empire in 19th century, the only Sikh empire that lasted almost 50 years. They defeated that empire, and then they kind of figured out ways of using Sikhs and incorporating Sikhs into their armies. And so Sikhs served in large numbers in World War I and II, like by the thousands, and they died by the thousands. And there are Americans, I've met Americans who've served or whose family members have served in World War I and II, who tell me stories of their loved ones who served in American veterans who've served in World War I and II, meeting Sikh soldiers, fighting alongside Sikh soldiers in both World War I and II. And these two images are actually from World War II. The one on the right is a Sikh soldier of part of the British Empire who freed Italy from German forces, and he's holding this German flag, the Nazi flag. Many Americans, actually, many Sikh Americans served in World War II without having access to citizenship. And we know that is not unique to Sikhs. That is true for many other communities where they served and died at times, paying the highest price with their life, but they were not given access, basic access to citizenship. And so the Sikh story kind of is very much tied with World War I and II, American story, and certainly British story. I want to sort of come back now, sort of coming now into the latter part of 20th century. Immigration reforms happen, immigration sort of gets opened up, and really it begins to change the demography of the United States. And again, you know, it gives broader access to Asian Americans at large to come in as professionals or laborers for a better life or escaping persecution at times. And this is one story of Sikh. This is an illustration by Hari Singh Everest, who came to California in the 1950s to study at Stanford. He studied communications, got a master's. So, you know, highly sort of educated man. And he illustrated this from his days at Stanford. I mean, he's showing all these eyes, people staring at him because he had a turban and a beard like myself. One of the things that I want to share with you here is he applied for a job after completing his education at Stanford at Chico State, and as a professor, he was fully qualified. And as you can see from the quote here, an administrator who interviewed him basically said to him, "You're overqualified for this position, but you're not an all-American boy. So you're overqualified. You're qualified for this job. You'll have it, but you're not an all-American boy." And therefore, he did not get this job. He was judged by his looks, perceived looks, and where he comes from, being overqualified and not given that job. And he eventually became an elementary school teacher. He was forced to sort of go down that path, which of course he, later on loved doing that. For 20 years, he was a elementary school teacher, the first South Asian to do that in that part of California. He ended up volunteering in many different institutions, including Department of Education, and sort of, paving the way for other Sikhs to sort of come in and become educators, and not just sort of professionals, as engineers and doctors, but, he sort of paved the way for Sikhs to become educators. And there have been Sikhs since, who have been educators. But to me, his depiction of what he went through, unfortunately, has not changed very much for Sikhs. So over, 60 years later, many Sikhs still live this experience of being stared at. And I'm going to show you an illustration of my own, that this part of the Sikh experience, unfortunately, has not changed. But again, we've made a lot of progress, but we have a long ways to go. The 1980s and 80s and 90s see a lot of sort of immigration that's happening along professional lines and refugees. Now, you might think of, there's a lot of Sikh or Indian or South Asian doctors and engineers who are coming in, or, people who are working in restaurants and working hard as, business people. A lesser known story is of refugees. So 1980s were a time in India where Sikhs were engaged in a political struggle. It's a very complicated story. They became target of state oppression. I actually spent part of my childhood in India with my parents, and I lived through the 1980s, a time when Sikh houses of worship and Sikhs were attacked and killed by the thousands. We don't even know the official numbers. That can go anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 and beyond. I want to sort of frame the story of this political struggle is framed by the powers to be in India, by the newspapers and by the leadership. And we see that here in the US too. Who gets to write the narrative of the people of that place? And it's a constant struggle because we know even today, how do you tell the story of slavery in America and who gets to tell it? It's the struggle. We're fighting it today and people are resisting it. Well, I don't want to learn that part. I don't want my kids learning that part of that story. So Sikhs have kind of gone through that in India as well. And I came out of that. I didn't come as a refugee. I was an American citizen, so I came back to the land of my birth. But a lot of Sikhs left India seeking political asylum in America, in Canada, in United Kingdom predominantly. And so there are a lot of Sikhs who live in the United States, escaping persecution, some having lost family members and loved ones. So United States, this sort of complicated place with its own complicated history of dark chapters, beautiful chapters, but serving as refuge to those seeking political asylum, escaping persecution and poverty. And so Sikhs certainly are part of that story as well, of coming here and finding peace and eventually prosperity through hard work. But at the same time, also being perceived because of our turban and beards, not as Sikhs. So most Americans don't know who we are. So that story sort of, it sort of continues. And I want to come into now the 21st century, and 21st century American story is really defined in the very early stages by what happened on September the 11th, 2001, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, and really that tragedy are one of our biggest vulnerable moments as a nation. Is the attacks of 9/11. It shook us, our vulnerabilities were exposed, literally our physical vulnerabilities, our emotional, psychological vulnerabilities. And now you mix in with who committed these terrorist attacks and what we know and what we don't know. So Sikh Americans bore the brunt of our vulnerability, our ignorance. And I got to face that. This was an illustration I created, not being aware of Hari Singh Everest's illustration from the 1950s, but this is what I felt like. I felt like this before 9/11 too, but especially after 9/11, like everybody's just looking at me. I'm in a museum. This is what I'm trying to show in this illustration, and people are just staring at me. And after 9/11, it really got intense. The first person to be killed in the hate crime wave after 9/11 was a Sikh man in Arizona, a gas station owner. And many, many other Sikhs have been attacked, arrested, beaten up, assaulted, places of worship destroyed, homes attacked, restaurants attacked. And this is not just Sikhs. Sikhs certainly have bore the brunt because of our turban and beards, but anybody who was perceived to be that other after 9/11, so Muslims, Hindus, Christians, as long as you had brown skin and somehow had those stereotypical features, it was fair game. And Sikhs to this day, it's been a challenge. Things have gotten better. Sikhs have engage themselves, figured out ways. How do you build those bridges? How do you respond to this moment? And these are some of the names that have been hurled at Sikh men and women, and others as well. But these are a few that have come my way from Americans from all walks of life. And I'm not talking about a few people here. I'm talking about people from all backgrounds, including whites, African Americans, Hispanics, men and women, young and old, boys, girls. Are they all bad people? Of course not. Are they all racist? Of course not. Good people engage in acts of racism and bias all the time. And so I realized that, but for me, the challenge was, how do I respond to this? Why are, these people who don't know me, who don't know my story, telling me all these things and telling me to go back home? And so I use the art of story. I discovered the art of cartooning, and I started using cartooning as a way to build bridges, to share my predicament, and also figure out ways of telling the story of Sikh characters with turban and beards, because I know I don't see myself represented in American stories, be it its culture, its political story, its entertainment. I just don't see myself represented. So I have been a cartoonist, an illustrator, and a storyteller in the aftermath of 9/11 to tell this essential American story that has not been told in the last 125 years. There has been a lot of changes since 9/11 happened. Sikhs, because we bore the brunt of American ignorance and vulnerability since 9/11, civil rights organizations that some of them existed before 9/11, but they became very active after 9/11. United Sikhs, Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, also known as SALDA, Sikh Coalition, just to name a few. There's many others. The first Sikh to serve in political office was Dalip Singh Sond from 1957 to 1963. He served in the US House of Representatives. So that's, we're going back into the last century, the middle of the last century, which is amazing. But it took a while then for Sikhs to really get active politically, and especially since 9/11. This is not an exhaustive list, but we've had men and women who have become mayors, who have joined education boards, city councils. One of the big names that you get to hear in this is Gurpreet Grewal, who was New Jersey's Attorney General, and he just recently has been appointed as the next Director of Enforcement at U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Only the second South Asian after Kamala Harris, after Vice President Kamala Harris, to be a Attorney General of a state. She represented California. He represented New Jersey. So a lot of progress being made. Sikhs becoming more active in American political and civic engagements. I want to share one more thing, and I usually get to do this when I give talks. I usually ask this as a question, as a quiz. I ask people, what's the first city that has an amazing distinction to have a mayor who was Sikh with a turban and a beard? And I ask people this question, and everybody goes, "Oh, it's cities in the coastal cities and cities in the north." So people say California, Michigan, New York, Washington State, right? Nobody guesses the right answer, because you just won't, because we stereotype geographies, we stereotype human beings. And in that story of stereotyping, we don't think that the South, the American South, would be home to the first city that has a Sikh mayor. As I asked this question of, what city has this distinction, it is amazingly, and I created a cartoon on this, it's Charlottesville. And I know nobody's going to guess Charlottesville. Unless you know the answer, you're just not going to guess Charlottesville, because Charlottesville in Virginia, and we all know in the last few years, we've heard about Charlottesville, not in a good way. But Charlottesville has a complicated history in the big sort of story of America. But Charlottesville now has a unique and amazing distinction that it is a city that had this man in its city council who happened to become mayor in 2012. And what an amazing distinction that my home city of New York will never have. Neither will many other sort of progressive open cities like San Francisco and Seattle will have. So keep in mind, America's story is complicated. The story of Sikhs is complicated. And there is never an easy black or white. It's complicated. And that's why it's so critical and important. And I cannot tell you the full story of Sikhs in this session, although I'm coming to the end of this storytelling session. But I hope that this is opening doors for you, all of you who are listening, to know, hey, wow, there's a lot of diverse stories here. And I want to now get into sort of, I have done my level best to kind of just give you a little hint of how diverse Sikhs are, incredibly diverse. And the 500,000 to 1 million Sikhs in America, you cannot put them in a box. They are Sikhs, but they are also Americans and so many other things. So they are doctors, engineers, accountants, and teachers and bankers. Yes, they are those things, but there are many other things. And two individuals I want to focus on. California-based physicist Narendra Singh Kapani, he passed away recently. He invented the fiber optics cable that is revolutionizing technology today. He's also known as a fiber optics, along with a title he shares along with another physicist who ended up winning Nobel Prize in Physics. And Narendra Kapani came pretty close to winning. And many of us would have probably known him if he had won that award. But he is critical to a lot of the high-speed internet technology that we use today. A Sikh man. Who did that? Of course, he wore many other labels. The other part is comedian Lily Singh. A lot of you probably know about her. She's Canadian, one of the big-time YouTubers. She was the first woman of color who got to host a late-night talk show in America. An amazing distinction. She comes from a Sikh heritage as well. Again, she wears many labels, but she also happens to come from Sikh heritage. There's two professions that probably touch all of your lives. American lives. And Sikhs really are overrepresented in those two professions. One is farming and one is trucking. Farming, again, it's tied back to where Sikhs come from. A lot of Sikhs come from Punjab, India, and it's a really deeply farming rich land. And that kind of explains why a lot of Sikhs, as they move around the globe, they have gotten into farming professions. The photograph you see is of a farmer, Didar Singh Bands, who is one of the biggest peach farmers in America. So if you're consuming fruits, dry fruits, vegetables from California, chances are a Sikh farmer but have their hands in that food chain and feeding you. So thank farmers, thank Sikh farmers when you eat produce from California. Trucking is just fascinating. Sikhs overrepresent themselves in trucking. Estimates from experts say 18% of truckers in America are Sikh truckers. That's amazing. 40% of truckers in California are Sikh truckers. So everything we consume and buy, clothes, books, you name it, electronics, things, they're all transported through trucks once they come onto shores from around the globe. It's very likely you have things in your home and in your workplace that were transported by Sikh drivers. So our lives are connected. We're all connected. And we need to find this connection. We need to do that storytelling and realize we might know a lot, but we don't know a lot. So America is a fascinating place with fascinating stories. We just need to dip into those stories and find those connections and uniquenesses as well. So there is a Captain America part to my story. Through cartooning in 2011, when the first Captain America movie came out, I had this vision of, you know what, Captain America needs to be a turban and bearded character. Why not? Captain America is a fictional character. Why are we not seeing a diversity of that character? So I created this character in 2011, took it to a comic festival in New York City, and people saw this poster and they kind of got confused. Some of them loved it. Some of them like, what's going on? Why is Captain America with a turban and beard? I said, well, why not? Captain America can have a turban and beard. And it just started its own kind of life for me. A life track and journey for me. A photographer asked me, hey, this is really cool. You should dress up as Captain America. And I said to her, no, I'm not going to dress up as Captain America. Why? Because I've been bullied all my life. I've lived through a genocidal massacre in India. I have lived through 9/11, where people have told me to go back home. People have verbally assaulted me for the last 20 years. It took Fiona, this photographer who's now become a friend of mine, a Brazilian Jewish American photographer based in New York City, a year to convince me to don that uniform. To push the notion of what it means to be American. So I dressed up in June 2013 as Captain America, and a day that has changed my life forever. I've been doing performance art since, and this performance art has opened doors. It has led many Americans to reach out to me and say, hey, we would like you to come to our school, our company, and tell your story, right? A fictional character from 1941 created by a Jewish American has the power to open doors for a turban and bearded American in post 9/11 America. I shared this last photograph with you of a boy who saw me posing as Captain America in Central Park. And he saw me for 10 minutes, very quiet. And then he goes to me, hey, what are you doing? Very sweet voice. And I said, well, I'm Captain America for the day. He goes, no, you're not. I said, why not? He goes, you're not white. And I thought for a moment, I'm thinking in my head, you know what? Okay, this, I see where this kid is coming from. He is representing what we all represent, which is our culture, right? And he's never seen an American superhero with a turban and beard. So I said to him, listen, I understand what you mean, but Captain America is a fictional character from 1941. We're in the 21st century. Captain America can be Asian American, African American, Hispanic, young, a boy like you. And he goes, black, yes, Hispanic, maybe, turban, beards, no. And he was not being mean. He was just being very genuine, honest. That's what kids are. They're super honest. He's like, he just couldn't fathom it. So I said to him, it's okay. I'm not offended, but remember for the rest of your life, you're going to have this image of me, skinny, turban, beard, glasses, Captain America. And you'll never be able to voluntarily delete that image from your head. And that's the power. That's why I do what I do. That's why I create cartoons with turban and beard. That's why I dress up as Captain America. I'm not comfortable doing it. I certainly wasn't comfortable doing it. I've become very comfortable. And I've traveled all over the US in that uniform. But I want to leave sort of those images and stories for people to just kind of counter the distorted narrative that we have learned in our heads. And I want to share with you this one amazing interaction I had. I was shooting a short film, Red, White, and Beard, that was mentioned in the introduction. In New York City, these three filmmakers from California came, they were following me, and I was in the subway, and this couple saw me twice. What are the odds in a single day you will run past the same couple twice on a subway? Rare, but it was meant to happen. They saw me first, they saw me the second time, and we started chatting. And 24 hours later, I get this email from this man who says, hey, it is odd and a little uncomfortable for me to be writing this email as I'm not typically an outgoing and social personality. And turns out, and as you read this, he is a police officer from Arizona who is visiting New York for the first time since after 9/11, when he was brought in as a responder. His specialty is psych ops. You know, his background is in psychology. He was brought in to support the first 9/11 responders who were working in the rubble and the trauma they had to go through to see the body parts. He was brought in to support them. He was coming back for the first time to go into that hallowed ground of the World Trade Center and that site. And he's also a soccer fan, so he wanted to come and watch soccer, football that was happening at a stadium with his wife. But he saw me, and the first time the second time he saw me, you know, very briefly, I told him what I'm doing. He Googled me, he found out about me, and he sent me this letter. And, you know, here is somebody who lives in Arizona, is a police officer, and if, you know, he's a white man, and if you see me and him, you would think they have almost nothing in common with each other. I would, based on this letter, and we become friends since. I've interviewed him since. Him and his wife had said, hey, if you're ever in Arizona, please come to our place. I think I have more in common with this police officer than I have with other Americans, including Sikh Americans. And that is what is amazing about the American story, is that, you know, we really rely on our eyes and on these distorted stereotypes, and just how we have evolved as an animal species. We rely too much on categorizing people, which is awesome, but it also has a downside that we just put each other in boxes, and we think we know each other by putting them in people in those boxes. Well, we don't. And the only way you can get to know somebody is to get to know their story, and creating that space for all of us to have the chance to tell that story is what is amazing about this space that Smithsonian has created for Asian Americans to tell their stories. And again, I cannot do justice to the Sikh story, but hopefully I've given you enough introduction that you can go out and seek out more of these stories and perhaps even tell your story. So once again, thank you to Smithsonian, to Andrea for making this storytelling session possible. This is me at Women's March. The first Women's March. I am in the background, you see the Washington Memorial, and this is my homage to women. Women really are the superheroes in our midst, because they bring forth human life, and they have faced a lot of challenges and stereotypes and prejudice in society across all communities, including the Sikh American community and Sikh community. We all have to do better, and you know, we learn from each other. As we become better versions of who, or at least we strive to become better versions of who we are, we have to learn from each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. And on that note, thank you all very much, and please find ways of telling your and other people's stories so we can find the differences and commonalities, and hopefully leave a better future for the young kids of today.